So when this was set up, I was asked to do not to do the funky individual creative thing that Brendan did. I was asked to do the organisational structured approach to creativity. So what I talk about should not be seen as a reflection on my relative personality differences to Brendan, right? We do interesting things around sort of funky technology. So a little bit about the Creativity Centre. What's happening here? I've got something very strange appearing on my screen. I'll just get rid of that. Okay. So we set this up in 2008. Well, at that point, I was head of the Centre for Human-Computer Interaction Design at City, and there was some seed funding which enabled us to, what we thought, spot an opportunity, which was to pull together all of the research and teaching around creativity and innovation in our university across what were 7 different diverse schools at the time, and put them all in one place, which was fun. And if you work in a university, quite challenging if you understand that. But then we also decided to run a master's, which taught creativity from 5 different perspectives. So we now run the Masters in Innovation, Creativity and Leadership. It's called the Michael for short. So you are taking the Michael if you pay the large fee. And one week you'll be doing creative writing, the next you'll be doing technologies and creativity, the week after that psychology, then you're doing creative performance arts, and you get creativity from all the perspectives. So that's led us into doing a lot of research from different angles. So on one side I'm doing computational creativity. We're building very sophisticated apps to essentially generate creative outcomes that can improve the quality of life of older people with dementia. We're looking at emergency planning, product design. We're building all these kinds of more interesting tools. And a lot of this came out of my early work, really as a software and systems engineer. I guess I'm probably best known for being a requirements person, which is normally a cue to clear the room at this point. But they're coming back. All right, that's good. They're still here for you, Brendan. I can tell, my friend. So I was always befuddled in my young days about where requirements came from. If you pick up the bloody UML or Rational Unified Process, they start from use cases. Use cases come down to earth, like Mr. Bean, if you remember how he used to drop to earth in the spotlight. They were kind of given in some way. Whenever I would set a challenge for my second-year undergraduate students to write some use cases and requirements for an ATM, they would go and look at the Barclays ATM in the square. There was no real sense at any point in software engineering that requirements work was essentially creative. And my first paper, which I submitted on this topic, which was a large case study based on some of the things I'll talk about this evening, was submitted to the IEEE RE conference in 2002, and it got the worst ever reviews I've seen. One of the reviewers actually wrote, "Is Maiden taking the piss?" I was actually helping write requirements on a major European air traffic control system. Fortunately, things have changed, but that's where I've come at it from. And that's what I'm going to talk about here today, because when you're trying to introduce creativity into quite large projects, there are particular challenges, but also opportunities. This is kind of weird here. Dear microphone, dear microphone. So, what I'm going to talk about is creative requirements processes and how we deliver them on large projects, just to juxtapose what was talked about earlier. Just throw away the idea that you elicit requirements. Asking people for requirements is wrong, it should be forbidden, don't do it. I'll talk about some of our creative experiences and requirements projects, just to give you some exemplars, and then back up and talk about a technique that we used for a long time, which is the creativity workshop. Builds a little bit on things that Brendan said. It's a risk-free space in which very conservative people could take risks for a couple of days to explore, create, make, throw ideas around, and eventually, hopefully, come up with a better specification. And then, over the years, I've moved a little bit away from requirements. People got sick of yet another creativity paper from Maiden, so I had to go and find new places to plant my paper seeds. So we've been moving more into creativity and service design, and the interesting challenge there is how to embed creativity in service design processes, and in particular, how to combine particular creativity techniques from the creativity field with particular types of design artifacts to the maximum effect. And that's really where we are at the moment, trying to develop some design principles around that. So, the reality about requirements, I shouldn't really have to say this to this audience, but there's always one or two can't see them in the dark, never mind. Okay, the bottom problem with asking people for the requirements in interviews and even sort of poorly facilitated focus groups is basically that people's requirements, future properties or properties of the future system, are really limited by what they think is possible. So if you wanted to understand your Twitter account in 2012, most people would not have considered it possible that you could produce a three-dimensional brick with some strange semantics attached to the jaggedy things, I'm not quite sure what they are, to do that. So their opportunities are limited. So people often sort of don't really optimize their requirements when asked what to do. Generally, customers are rear-view mirrors in terms of understanding what they really want. That's not to say you don't involve them in the requirements process, but simply asking them is not very effective. But we can exploit the fact that essentially cognitively people can't separate requirements from design. I can't do it. I start, ideas rush into my head, and then eventually I'll tease them out into requirements and design and do various abstractions and making them measurable and so on. But cognitively it doesn't happen in a top-down way. People can't reason like that. I think the people that reason top-down in a structured way died out. Because basically they start to conceptualize what this very big, aggressive, sharp-toothed animal coming to what them was. Let's produce a UML model of it. You're dead by the time you've done that. It's the people that are rapidly thinking of ideas as you go. And I would argue, actually, in a lot of cases, if you interview a user about what they want from a future system, and they say, I would like an X, what you're doing as an analyst is actually coming in at the very tail end of their own individual creative thinking. If they've they've undertaken some thought processes to go from the as-is state to a future to-be state, and their requirements are articulating some future property or quality of a system, then they've actually done some creative thinking. And all you're doing is coming in at the end of that process and saying, right, what have you thought? That seems to be not very supportive of a wider requirements and design process. So our point for starting all of this was to actually try and get in right at the beginning of that thought process and facilitate the creative generation of requirements. And I like this quote from Dennis Lasden, which is, I think, okay, it's written for architecture, but I think it applies very nicely to a lot of software and requirements work, which is, our job is to give the client on time and on cost, not what he wants, written in a certain time, I'm sorry about this, but what he never dreamed he wanted. And when he gets it, he recognizes it as something he wanted all of the time. I think that's what requirements people really should be doing. Unfortunately, most are not, but it's all about delivering on something that they never knew they wanted. So let's give you some examples. All my examples are going to come, or most of them are going to come from air traffic control. It's the biggest area that I've worked in terms of complexity. I've worked on specifications, some quite large UK and European air traffic control systems. And we've applied creativity in those projects. I should say that these are quite challenging domains. By almost character and definition, your average air traffic controller is pretty conservative with a small c. Things go wrong, they end up in jail. So basically, they're not looking for radical change. So the idea of being creative in thinking of redesigns of their work and technology doesn't necessarily come naturally to them. Anybody recognise that airport?
Yes.
Where?
It's Belfast.
Yes, it is. It's Belfast City Airport. Or now, it was Belfast City Airport when we were there. It's now called George Best. Oh, it is. It's got a very big bar. So we were there about 7 years ago, and we were helping them rethink their aircraft management systems, basically where everything moved around the airport and came in and took off, so as to improve the, essentially reduce the pollutions and noise emissions footprints to try and make it more green as an airport. And there are ways you could do that. Every time an aircraft stops on the tarmac and revs its engines again, there's lots of noise and heat and so on. So you could optimize the movements around the airport. And we used a very simple transformational creativity technique called Constraint Removal. It's very simple. If you're in a room and you ask people for good ideas, hands don't tend to come up. If you ask people to tell you what you can't do, hands go up by more hands than they have. So you can use that in creativity work. You get people to say, tell us a constraint, okay, and then let's actually imagine a world in which it's been removed. So one of the constraints that came up from the WAGs in Belfast was weather variability. One of the real problems we have in managing noise and pollution, etc. at Belfast is weather variability. So in the session we ran, we said, okay, just imagine that there is no weather variability. Yes, it gets a bit of a laugh there. But once we got them over the humour of this, so imagine the weather is always the same. And they started to come up with ideas. And here are some of them. Steam catapults. Moved on that one. Glided approaches. Weather-adapted approach routes. So basically, if you knew where the weather was always coming from, you could always blow, ensure that the wind blows the noise over East Belfast or West Belfast. Try not to get into politics there, that's dangerous. So anyway, but these were all ideas that emerged. But of course, some of these ideas, if thought through, can be possible. So what you can actually do, they eventually took some of these ideas and turned them into storyboards. And the key idea was, if you had more accurate weather prediction, you could actually do the prediction of where the wind was coming from and act as if you had no weather variability. So they embedded some much more accurate weather recording ideas. Now you could argue they could have got to that idea a different way, but they've been thinking about this problem for quite some time before we used this technique over about a 1 hour period to come up with this sort of radical shift of challenging the boundaries and constraints. So I would argue in that case, they didn't know what they wanted, but when they never dreamed they wanted, but when they saw it, they desired it afterwards. Very much part of an ongoing requirements process with, everyone from local politicians to air traffic controllers to people from British Midland. Another one that we ran very early on, one of our first workshops, was specifying the requirements on a system that would redirect aircraft flying at each other at about 400 miles an hour at about 10,000 meters. So a system had already predicted they're likely to crash in about 20 minutes or have a very near miss. Let's have another system that would automatically compute the optimum route to get them to their destinations without crashing. We ran a workshop and we invited an expert in 17th century Indian textiles, a guy called Roddy, lovely gentleman. And he came over, we were in Paris, and he came over with a selection of his textiles. Now the reason we chosen these was because they have a lot of symmetrical patterns. And we'd already, in early discussions, identified a lot of pattern recognition going on in airspaces and so on by the controllers, as well as in some of the algorithms that automate this process. So we got them to play with, he presented for about 45 minutes in the middle of an extremely expensive consultancy workshop we were running. They sat there, all of these air traffic controllers from all over Europe and airspace managers talking about textiles. The project manager we were working for was shitting himself. He was really nervous, his reputation was on the line, even just running creativity workshops. One of the fascinating ideas that came out of this was from the French controllers. The French controllers really got into the issue about the aesthetics, what they found the most beautiful in these patterns. And why was this relevant? It's because they take pride in their work. If the machine generates an algorithm that they then, a route change that they then pass on to the pilots, and it's not elegant, they're not proud. They don't want to use it. So this exploring these types of complex patterns actually led to the discovery of new requirements based on a form of analogical reasoning with this pattern matching. Again, they never thought of this beforehand, but by exploring different creativity techniques it emerged. The third one was a point at which we ran 5 days of workshops. Each workshop was 2 days, so we ran 2, and then we were halfway through the third one. And we had literally hundreds of ideas for a system that was about multi-sector planning. So basically rethinking the whole scheduling gate to gate across Europe. So you fly from Rome, you fly across about 5 airspaces, it's sub-optimized in terms of the scheduling. You just completely change the boundaries, rethink the scheduling process. You ended up with a lot of material. We thought, what the hell do we do here? We thought this is a bit like storyboarding a Hollywood film. So we got a Hollywood scriptwriter in, and she told us how to do it. And apparently it's a bit like that. I don't know, maybe we have so many films are like they are. Anyway, maybe not a good source of creativity. But anyway, we applied this quite interestingly. At the end, in the last day, we basically gave each team of air traffic controllers, about 4 or 5 in each team, all of the ideas that had been generated over the last 5 days of workshops. Everyone was pre-printed, and for the day that we were there before, we then hand-wrote everything. There was everything from visualizations of the airspace to ideas, concepts, actors, systems, and so on. We basically then explained how a film storyboarding activity is, and say, film storyboard, the future use of this air traffic control system for multi-sector planning in Europe. And what you can basically, well, maybe you can't see, is essentially this was a 5-meter long piece of paper, propped up at a kind of draftsman's board level, about that angle. And they could walk along it. And what was fascinating was the physical nature of it. Basically, they first of all invented all of their own semantics for it. So the meanings of the arrows, what's on top, what's underneath, what's left. Left and right is kind of obvious, time from left to right. What's at the top, what's at the bottom. All of these semantics emerge rather than being imposed by a method or a representation. This freedom of expression is really important in the creative process. There was also the beauty of the tactile flexibility of the artifacts that really I still think resist most digital representations. You simply wouldn't have the richness of the experience if you'd done this digitally. And ownership was really important. So they were at this for about 4 or 5 hours. It was the easiest day's consulting money I've made in a long time. I had to sit back and just watch it happen. And at times, some of the guys, they would pick up like half a dozen cards, go off into a corner room. So they physically took ownership of these ideas and concepts. We'll put them on, say, A3 piece of paper, map up what this should look like. So they had the ownership, they did that local creativity, and then they brought it all back, kind of laid it down on the bigger picture. Said, what do you think of this? So again, the physicality enabled much more expressive ownership of concepts during the creative process. And one of these storyboards became the backbone for the rethought multi-sector planning system. I'm not sure if it ever got there, but at least at the concept stage it was strong. Again, these concepts they weren't able to articulate at the beginning, they didn't know they would want them at the beginning, but they recognized them once we produced them. Okay, so I'm losing track of time here, it's the beer I reckon. Never mind, so what I want to say is, backing up from that, just some experiences about how we actually went about this process. So, one thing that always struck me, I was a bit of a snob, a computer science snob when it came to creativity. And then I started looking at the publications. There are more published papers around creativity than there are in design and computer science, in interaction design and computer science. This is a field that's been around for a lot longer than computer science and its various spin-offs, and is studied from many, many different sources. The richness is extraordinary. I think most people from our world really don't appreciate that. There's a huge body of work to draw upon. I use this very simple prototypical definition of creativity, which is the ability to produce work that's novel and appropriate. So novelty on its own is not enough. If I was to stand on my head doing this talk, not that I could, then it wouldn't necessarily be creative, it would just be wacky. So it's got some appropriateness. And the notion of surprise as a human emotion is often associated with creativity as well. Of course, novelty is a relative concept, so just running through this, you have H creativity, which is historical creativity, something like sort of mapping the genome, something that's unique to person kind. On the other hand, you've got P creativity. One individual in a team is creative to come up with an idea. It's still creativity, even if the rest of the team already had come up with that idea, but they weren't interacting with it. The definition I like to work with in this context is S creativity, which is situated creativity. The creativity is local to that team or group of users or project. So even if the team down the corridor comes up with the idea, you're still being creative. So that's how we approach this. So we were running big requirements projects. We weren't just doing the creative part, we were doing full specifications, we were doing complex goal modeling of these systems, exploring the early architectures. So we had a challenge of how do we get creativity into these really big projects? So we came up with this notion of the creativity workshop. Shocking in hindsight, wasn't it? Not really hard. But it became a risk-free space, as I said at the beginning, in which we could pull everyone together. And our trick wasn't to use the creativity workshop at the start of the process. So by the time we ran a creativity workshop in one of these requirements processes that may run up to 9 months, because these are big things, we'd have already done quite a lot of observations in air traffic control towers. We built up some human activity models and task descriptions. We'd have a sort of overview of the future system in terms of its boundaries, key goals, and so on. And we would also have an idea of what the technical solutions could be. You never go into one of these things not knowing what the technologies might be. So we've got a fairly good idea of what the problem space is and a fairly hefty amount of solution space ideas. And what we would seek to bring out of this was basically the UML, I had to use it, use case model. The two things that would come out would be that use case model and storyboards describing each of the use cases that people could then take away and actually write the boring use case specifications from. So that's how it fitted, and we introduced the creativity workshop right in that space. This is what one looks like. I'm wearing a suit there, so I was being paid. Sorry. So this was at the end of the departure management system specific workshop for Heathrow and Charles de Gaulle. So I had a team of French air traffic controllers and British air traffic controllers working together for 2 days. So what to say about it? At any point in the workshop, all of the system models are available for everyone to see. So everything's visible. What you can't see in this room is that there are about 18 of these 2 metre by 1 metre pinboards going all the way around. Each of them represents a different conceptual space for the system, basically one of a nascent use cases. There are about 20 use cases. And an idea is not valid, it doesn't count within the process until it's posted on the wall. It has to be put. But the beauty about putting them on particular spaces with meaning was that the ideas were easier to understand once you put them on the wall. So often you have the problem of trying to understand what the heck was this idea. It's written in 3 or 4 words. You can gain meaning and find it much easier to make sense of ideas when they're placed in context. So associating them to a use case or an activity or a particular actor enabled that sense making to happen much more easily. All of the ideas were color-coded on cards of different colors in order to indicate where they came from for traceability purposes. We tried to create a very sort of informal atmosphere. However, everything was heavily scripted at all times. I think Brendan said something about it doesn't have to have purpose. Why? Actually, in this kind of activity, if you want to maintain flow, the notion of both social flow and individual flow, which most people understand as a key characteristic of creative work, is actually determined by a goal that's not too hard but not too difficult either. It's just achievable, just beyond your reach, and you can achieve it with a little bit of learning. So actually goals are really important, and that's constantly what we were doing in these workshops. We used traditional workshop formats, U-shaped tables, and we used a lot of game playing to encourage people to interact in different ways. This was a balloon animal making competition between the French and the British air traffic controllers. The French won. That normally gets a boo. Maybe we're becoming more enlightened. The way we set up the workshop was based on a number of relatively stable models. So there was a strong notion of divergence and convergence. So in each part of the activity, we would start from a particular point. We would explicitly try and diverge to increase the number of ideas, but before the end, because it's just not traditional open-ended brainstorm, we would then try and converge. We then did something that irritates a lot of the computational creativity community. We used Henri Poincaré's model based on his own reflections about creative process within this, in which during diverging and converging there would be 4 activities: preparation, incubation, illumination and verification. So preparation and verification kind of explain, self-explanatory. The illumination is typically brainstorming, idea generation, reporting in groups. The incubation is the interesting period. Typically it may last 45 minutes and a half to an hour, in which people would simply do other tasks. You pay me to come in to facilitate you to do something that's got nothing to do with what you're paying me to come in to do. So we had, in air traffic control, we've had the railway scheduling lady who knows everything about the British railway system scheduling. We've had the chef, Peter Gordon came, if you know him from the Providors. He came and talked about fusion cooking and restaurant design. We had Roddy, the Indian textiles chappie. We had the very boring man who worked on highway signs on motorways on the British network. Hope he's not in the audience. Tough, boring as hell. Anyway, so we had all these kinds of people come in, and they would simply be given a job, and they'd go, I don't know anything about air traffic control. It's okay, just talk about what you do. Now, it wasn't random. We were carefully designing the purposes. We were trying to design analogies and other kinds of underpinning creative knowledge that could be transferred to the domain. So that was typically what would happen in one session. Each session would typically be about half a day. So we would do this time and time and time again in the workshop. You wouldn't do it in one go, you'd do it in several goes. And in each of these, we would try and trigger a particular type of creativity. So Margaret Bowden identifies three basic types of creativity: transformational, exploratory, and combinational. Transformational is basically saying, the boundaries of my space are wrong. I need to change my search space to make it bigger. I'm going to challenge a constraint. I'm going to say, this assumption doesn't really hold. So I'm going to search a much bigger space, like weather variability at Belfast City Airport. Exploratory is then searching that space more effectively to find ideas. And then combinational creativity is essentially taking two or more ideas and combining them in previously unforeseen ways which are interesting. I think this is fascinating. Brendan talked about this. If you've grown up in any kind of engineering, software engineering culture, the concept of divide and conquer is so drilled into us, it's actually quite hard to pull back from it. I see this time and time again in clients. So combining things in unusual ways and saying, it's okay, let's see where this goes, is something you can do. So typically at the beginning of our workshop, the first session will be transformational, trying to enlarge the boundaries. By the end, like in storyboarding, we're combining hundreds of ideas together. And what we found when we first ran this was that we wouldn't encourage people to update the models after each session. And the idea generation process was rather like a fireboat display. It went off in all directions. So typically now after a morning or an afternoon session, there is a revised version of the system model, use case model. So there's always a common reference point to go back to. When we started these, we ran them for 1 day because we didn't have the balls to run them for 2 days with 20 clients. We actually found over time that almost, well not almost, but a lot of the real creative value tends to come halfway through the second day. Now I've never studied this scientifically, but I think there's a number of things going on there. It's partly about trust. After 27, 28 hours, these disparate stakeholders start to trust each other more. I think the other thing is incubation. We're trying to foster it within sessions, but there's also incubation overnight. The dreaded sleeping on it is not as stuffed as it sounds. My mother would go, "Go on, Neil, sleep on it." Actually, it's incubation, it's reflection. And that was really valuable in these workshops, especially when there's 120, 150 ideas being generated on the first day. You can't get your head around it. You need to reflect. You need to incubate what you've learned. So actually, a lot of the real value comes on the second day. So if you can get your clients to be there, and I know a lot of you are probably working on agile projects where you have an hour, that's a different talk. There's one that you did here, I think. But that's how we did it. So second day workshops were really valuable. So the sorts of things we worked on, I've already given heads up on these, are departure management system at Heathrow, so a very large project, really the whole of the rescheduling. So if you ever sat at the Heathrow tarmac and been overtaken by 5 planes on a Friday night and you want to go home, it's because of this system. And then multi-sector planning was rethinking the whole scheduling from gate to gate, taking into account multiple systems. So that's the scale at which we applied this for quite a long time. And we could have still been doing it now, but we got a bit bored. So we went off and started doing other things. So quickly, just to finish up about design thinking. So I've been fascinated by design thinking for a while, and I have a criticism of it. It's not creative enough. There's a strong focus on observation, collaboration, rapid prototyping, visualizing. It's user-centered. It's got the word creative in it. It's co-creative. It's all about sequencing the service, providing lots of evidence of intangible qualities of the service. It's holistic, what that means. But I guess my real concern is that there's very little explicit use of creativity theories and processes from this very vast literature that seems to have found its way into service design. So there are all the things that we've been piloting over the last year or two in our consultancy work and also in some of our teaching, is to say, let's try and introduce creativity techniques much more explicitly into your service design process. That is a hinge, by the way, rather than a Viking sword from the British Museum or wherever it is. How can we take these notions of evidencing, sequencing, co-creation and combine them in a principled manner with very well-established creativity techniques which have certain qualities? So we've been doing this. I'll skip over that bit, we're going to run out of time, but here's an example. So desktop walkthroughs are well-established service design technique. You essentially build an abstract three-dimensional model of the service or the thing that you're designing. People can then interact with it, they can play out scenarios, they use props and so on, so you could be designing, this may be a physical manifestation of an abstraction, or it could be something, a model of something physical. The choice is yours. And they're wonderful, they're great. However, there isn't a lot of explicit creativity guidance. So what we've done in our work is explicitly guide them, combine them with a technique called creativity triggers, which comes from a colleague of mine called James Robertson from the Atlantic Systems Guild. And basically what he's done is abstract away 35 years of consulting experience and realise that innovative products and ideas often have a number of shared qualities. He's almost done the Triz trick for software engineers and product designers. And he says there are some sort of very simple qualities that appear again and again and again in products and ideas and services that people find innovative. They're often about connecting. It's about increased connection between stakeholders or participants. It's often about providing more information and choice. It's about being more convenient, which you could just reduce to taking a step out of something, do something that otherwise your customer or client would have to do. So he provides these with guidelines and saying, whatever you do with your creative thinking, try and get to a solution with a quality like this. So it's not divergence, it's very convergent, but it's still creative because the outcome is new and useful, albeit as part of a convergent process. And why do we use that with desktop walkthroughs? Well, that's essentially what you're doing with desktop walkthroughs. You're exploring different combinations so you can narrow down the options. Both are convergent, but exploratory. So we're combining these to try and embed creative thinking more explicitly in the process. And we have about half a dozen of these couplings that we're experimenting with, a particular artifact and a particular creativity technique. So, for example, we use constraint removal, which I showed with the variability problem, with design sketching. Those two work very well together. Here's an example of how we did it where I live. So I decided a bit of civic pride got the better of me last year, and I joined the newly formed North Finchley town team. Dipped my toe into local politics. I'm still here. And basically, we did we ran a consultation alongside the council, Barnet Council, with hundreds of people over 3 days to bring in and generate their ideas. Now normally, if the council runs the consultation, they'll get about 90% problems. You know, people come in and have a gramble. And you might get 10% needs. They're rather bland needs. But what you've got to do if you really want co-creation with local citizens is to get them to think more creatively. So we did this, we combined various triggers with essentially a desktop walkthrough that was based on a map of the North Finchley town centre. So there's Lego there, and there's toys, and there's plasticine, and the dreaded stickies, of course, and a large map. And we basically encouraged people to walk through what they did in the town centre, what worked well, what didn't work well. They did this individually, or they formed little groups. It was in a theatre in a public space, so anyone could have wandered in at any time. And it was very effective at then triggering much more creative stimulation they would have got had you ran even just the maps on their own, people standing around. You're explicitly saying, what would make it more convenient? What would get you better connected? What gives you more information and choice? What makes things greener? Focused combination of a technique and an artifact in a convergent process. And then later we followed that up actually by going into some of the spaces that have been renovated and people could actually participate in the space. So this is actually shops that are being regenerated and people would actually go in and explore what they do, and we would again creatively stimulate them as they came through to say, what do you want to do in this space? How would you use it? What do you want to do? All driven by these creativity triggers. I'm being waved at to almost stop, right? Yeah. All right, here we go. Last slide. It's PowerPoint. You notice I did PowerPoint just to juxtapose again with my friend here. Opportunities for collaboration. We're very interested in trying to help you make your work more creative in a range of ways, from requirements to design to mobile apps. We can do all these things. I'm running out of things to say now. So there's my Twitter, there's my blah blah email address. I'm happy to take questions and talk.